Hey there, I'm FakeFox and I welcome you to my complete PvE healing class guide for Nightblade. The Nightblade is a powerful and versatile healing class with interesting mechanics that lead, at least in my opinion, to a unique and engaging playstyle. In this video, I will explain everything you need to know to effectively build and play the Nightblade as a PvE healer. We will go over all abilities and passives, explore the different playstyle and set options, and learn how to tie it all into an effective build with attributes, champion points, and so on. But before we get into any of that, I want to quickly explain where the class currently stands in the PvE meta. Nightblade's initial rise in popularity came primarily from the ability scaling hybridization introduced in Update 33 Ascending Tide. Especially in high-end raiding, support classes are often chosen based on their unique group buffs. The scaling hybridization giving groups free choice over which damage modifiers to stack allowed groups to choose a Nightblade over Templar and Sorcerer. In subsequent updates, Nightblade received multiple additions to its support kit and is currently together with Warden one of the dominant healer classes. Apart from providing minus savagery, weapon critical chance as its class passive, Nightblade offers permanent major expedition, 30% movement speed, to the group and exceptional damage mitigation with major and minor cowardice. It also has probably the best ulti-gen tied with Necromancer, and good unique healing mechanics and damage potential on top of that make it a well-rounded healing class. Nightblade excels in kiting positions with its excellent mobility and survival, but can also make quite a bit out of a static healing position by micromanaging ulti-gen and complex support sets. To start things off, I will now talk you through the 3 class skill lines, explaining the use of all relevant abilities and what passives you need to be aware of. Siphoning is Nightblade's most healing focused line. The passives increase magic and healing for slotted abilities, and include 2 amazing ulti-gen passives. Catalyst generates 20 ultimate when drinking a potion, and Transfer generates 2 ultimate for using a Siphon ability every 4 seconds. The first active skill is Strive. Morphed into Swallow Soul, it is a good spammable, especially for solo content because of the very potent self-heal. Funnel Health is more interesting for a healer. For 4-player groups, it is one of the stronger healing over time abilities and can also be used for some additional damage in hybrid builds. Malevolent Offering is Nightblade's single target burst heal. It's unique in that it deals damage to you, but it is exceptionally cost efficient for this kind of ability. Healthy Offering is usually the preferable morph, as this is not an ability you want to be spamming anyways, and so the additional healing power for your other abilities is far more impactful than a cost reduction. Cripple is a single target dot, so it can be used for sense redress. The Debilitate morph can also be interesting to apply minor magicka steal. Siphoning Strikes is your sustainability. The morph choice simply depends on which resource you need. It's activated by light attacks, so weaving is more important for Nightblade than other healing classes. Morphed into Sap Essence, Drain Power is a strong damage and healing ability against large groups of enemies, perfect for off-healer builds. Power Extraction, on the other hand, provides minor cowardice, a damage reduction of around about 5%. The ultimate Soul Shred is not a great damage ability. Soul Siphon is a relatively strong healing ultimate, however I still do not recommend using it. Healing ultimates are simply kind of pointless in PvE. If you need a defensive ultimate, just use Barrier instead. It's way stronger than any healing ultimate. Shadow offers more amazing passives. Your recoveries are increased by 15%. Shadow abilities last 2 seconds longer and grant you Major Resolve for 6 seconds. The duration increases with heavy armor pieces, but you still don't want to be wearing heavy armor. Your health is also increased by 3% for every shadow ability. Veiled Strike passively increases movement speed and damage when morphed into concealed weapon. Surprise Attack provides minor breach via the Sundered status effect, which can be interesting if the tank somehow does not provide that. Shadow Cloak as the Dark Cloak morph is not relevant for PvE healing as it's only a self-heal and also scales with maximum health. Shadowy Disguise makes you invisible, which is just cool if nothing else, but not getting attacked is also neat for cheesing your way through dungeons. Path of Darkness buffs Major Expedition to everyone in it. It's absolutely amazing. Movement speed can be such a strong defensive tool and important for kiting positions and mobile fights in general. And it's just nice to get around quicker. Refreshing Path is a pretty decent healing ability and the go-to morph for us. It also provides minor recovery buffs. The duration is really short though, with only 4 seconds, which is something you need to keep in mind. Aspect of Terror debuffs Major Cowardice, a roughly 10% damage reduction. Where you can apply it, it is one of the best defensive effects in the game. We want to be using Mass Hysteria, as Manifestation of Terror does not get activated by bosses. Summon Shade, morphed into Dark Shade, is a strong damage ability. It debuffs minor maim, that doesn't really matter though, so only use it if you have an open slot and want to deal more damage. Shadow Image allows you to teleport to your shadow. Even for kiting positions, I never found that to be overly helpful. It's mostly a novelty ability to have some fun with and get around quicker. Consuming Darkness is a defensive ultimate. It's not necessarily bad, but Barrier is just better in most situations. It excels if the incoming damage over 10 seconds is so high that it immediately breaks Barrier. There's probably not even a handful of mechanics in the entire game where that is even the case. Major Protection has also been nerfed drastically a while ago and also made more widely available, making this ultimate unfortunately even less useful. The Assassination skill line contains our unique class buff. If we deal critical damage while an assassination skill is slotted, the group gets 20 seconds of minus savagery. We also have increased penetration when flanking, increased critical chance for slotted assassination abilities, and get 1000 resources when enemies die. Assassin's Blade is a good execute ability if we want to deal damage. We most likely use Impale, even though Killer's Blade is stronger, but it's a stamina ability, so we could not sustain spamming it. Teleport Strike, morphed into Lotus Fan, applies minor vulnerability. It is really good for AoE encounters because most other minor vulnerability sources are only single target. Be aware that the debuff only lasts 10 seconds though, and not 20 like the dot component. Also, it can be a really janky ability to use. Blur is a terrific defensive skill. Major Evasion is a massive damage reduction in many encounters, and the dodge cost reduction is also neat. We usually want to morph it into Phantasmal Escape, as we have minor resolve from Combat Prayer anyway. Mark Target applies Major Breach, but that is not particularly relevant. There are just too many other sources. You can use Reaper's Mark if you go for damage in trash encounters. Grim Focus is a really strong damage ability. For healing, it is mostly interesting for the passives. Stacking it up increases weapon and spell damage. The ultimate Deathstroke is a good single target damage ultimate, but also really interesting for its passive effects. Incapacitating Strike increases sustain, and Soul Harvest generates ultimate from kills. In the next part of this guide, I will give you an overview to build creation for the Nightblade healer. We will go over ability bar setups, set combinations, champion points, and how to tie it all into an effective build. The idea for this format is teaching you how to create your own build over just showing you some build to copy, as actually understanding what you're doing and being able to adjust your build for every situation is just hugely beneficial. So let's begin with how I generally set up my bars. I essentially follow a checklist and then choose suiting abilities for each requirement the specific build has to fulfill. Burst healing is a good starting point, I think. We essentially always want to have combat prayer since it provides important buffs. Additionally, Healthy Offering makes sense in many situations. We can use it as an emergency heal for players out of combat prayer range, or to generate ultimate and increase our healing with minor mending. Healing Ward is another option specifically to counter healing debuffs on specific players. Not really a burst heal, but the AoE counterpart to that would be Bone Surge. The majority of our healing though should come from healing over time abilities. We almost always want to have the Refreshing Path, as it also provides great buffs and passives. Additionally, Energy Orb is often needed to provide the group with the important combustion synergy. Other strong HOTS are Healing Springs, Echoing Vigor, Ring of Preservation, as well as Radiating Regeneration and Funnel Health in very mobile encounters and with small groups. Moving on to the general support, we want to have some weapon ability to keep our backbar enchantment going. That is usually Elemental Blockade. Then we need to think about which more general buffs and debuffs we need to provide. For example, Lifesteal with Overflowing Altar, Magicka Steel with Elemental Drain, Siphon Spirit or Debilitate, Minor Vulnerability with Lotus Fan, and so on. Maybe also Major and Minor Cowardice with Mass Hysteria and Power Extraction. There are a few more, but these are the most common ones, I think. We also usually need some way to provide minor savagery. If we aren't playing with Lotus Fan anyway, Incapacitating Strike, Phantasmal Escape, or Merciless Resolve are good options. The rest is more dependent on what sets we are using and relatively self-explanatory. We will talk about what sets we actually want to be using later. If we then have any open bar space, we can always just take more HOTS, damage abilities, or quality of life abilities like Siphoning Strikes. Setups for trash encounters are not much different, unless you switch to DD of course. We want to focus more on abilities that can be pre-buffed, as trash encounters are usually very short, and our debuffs should be AoE. Nightblade is pretty blessed in that regard with Mass Hysteria, Power Extraction, and Lotus Fan. Now that we know exactly what abilities we need to arrange them in a sensible way, and we're good to go. As a full healer, we want the Healing Staff as our front bar weapon, and the passives that affect our healing performance the most concentrated on there. So mostly healing power, sustain, and survivability. We also want our burst healing and very short abilities there. The assassination ability for minor savagery can actually be on our back bar just fine, as it's pretty much guaranteed that we get a critical hit, while on the back bar at least every 20 seconds, just by chance. Everything else is just personal preference. Set passives come primarily from our class lines. Additionally, we also need whatever weapons and armor we are using, so usually Restoration Staff, Destruction Staff, Light and Medium Armor. Also important is Undaunted and maybe Mages and Fighters Guild if we use some of those abilities, and of course also the racial passives. From the Alliance War, we should get Magicka Aid for some extra regen whenever we are using Barrier or Purge, and medicinal use from Alchemy is also absolutely essential for longer lasting potion effects. For the race, I recommend Breton the most for the amazing sustain and survivability, but Altmer, Dunmer and Khajiit also work really great, especially if dealing damage is also a consideration for you. Argonian can also work, but I do not recommend it. You might think it works well with Nightblade as it also adds additional potion effects, but it really doesn't synergize and can even be detrimental for certain builds. Next topic are the sets, which I separated into dungeons and trials. For dungeons, the 5-piece sets are quite simple. Spell Procure and Master Architect is, in my opinion, generally stronger than any other option. Similar offensive support sets like Saxial Champion or Powerful Assault are solid replacements. The only other set type I see as potentially very strong is Ultigen sets, particularly Akarsa's Genius, Drake's Rush, and Pillager's Prophet. These are no doubt weaker in terms of sustained DPS, but allow for more frequent DPS spikes, which can be extremely good in dungeon content to burn through difficult phases or trash groups and skip mechanics. And it is also defensively quite potent due to how powerful Barrier is. For the additional sets, I think, at least for a full healer build, Pearls of Elnathay and a monster set, particularly Magma Incarnate, Symphony of Blades, or Oseason the Inferno, work best. Spalda of Ruin is another very strong mythic, but it only works with an ability-altering weapon instead of a monster set, which I consider weaker overall. If you are going for an off-healer build, so a hybrid between healer and DD, both of the mythics are not really an option, so you are probably best off with a support monster set and damage mythic or ability altering weapon combination. Trial setups are often far more specific to the group and encounter, but with the exception of Asylum Sanctorum, we see the combination of two particular build ideas absolutely dominate. That is one healer with Roaring Opportunist and Joel's Guidance, and the second one with an Ultigen setup and Spell Procure. Unless the group is having 2 players with Master Architect or War Machine for Major Slayer, which can be better for short side boss encounters and also bosses with pronounced burst phases and damage stops, the Wrong Opportunist and Joel's Guidance combination is pretty much set in stone and usually played with Spalder of Ruin because of its extremely high sustain, and also a Master Restoration staff usually as a filler weapon. The build can be played on a Nightblade without issues, however because of its strong ulti-gen, Nightblade is currently more often used with the second build option. This is a build centered around Pearls of Elnofey with Spellpower Cure or Olorim and a second 5-piece set that capitalizes on the generated ultimate. Most commonly Pillager's Prophet. Other options are Saxony Champion and Master Architect. By playing each 5-piece set with one weapon, this build can also fit a monster set. Nezaré is popular because it also benefits from more ultimate, but other support monster sets also work. Like I said, there are plenty of other set options as well that are less common but might make sense in specific situations, so let's quickly go over the more important ones and talk about how they work for Nightblade. The class lacks elemental damage, which sucks for Elemental Catalyst. It's possible to use on a Nightblade, but very limited. Same goes for Kratos Behemoth and also Senzu Dress to a degree, though Nightblade has 2 single target dots with decent secondary effects, so I actually consider it quite good for Senzu Dress. I also find Martial Knowledge to be quite pleasant on Nightblade, as it doesn't oversustain and has good tools to survive with low stamina. Other somewhat commonly used sets are Powerful Assault, Stonetalker's Oath, Symphony of Blades, Osees in the Inferno, and the Black Rose Restoration stuff, but class choice is absolutely not relevant for any of them. In terms of armor types, when combining these sets, we generally want to avoid heavy armor pieces. Light and medium can both be beneficial. Light gives us better magicka sustain and medium stronger healing when sustain is not an issue. For DPS, it is a similar thing. Light armor increases penetration, but if that is not needed, medium increases damage more. Let's continue with the traits and enchantments. Our armor should generally be Divines with magicka. There is certainly an argument for infused prismatic enchants, especially on the big pieces. I personally find the difference to be negligible, and Divine is simpler and more flexible. Infused jewelry is generally slightly more efficient than arcane. In terms of enchantments, we usually go for either magicka regeneration if we need more sustain, or otherwise spell and weapon damage. Alchemical acceleration is another option to generate more ultimate from the catalyst passive. In terms of sustain, you should really test what you actually need. I see a lot of players over-sustaining, and it's a huge waste of healing and damage. About 1500 to 2000 magicka recovery is a good starting point in my opinion. For the frontbar weapon, I generally recommend Decisive for additional ultimate generation. If you want to deal damage, go for Precise. Powered has the best healing output, but I don't think it makes sense to go for it by default. Charged can also be a good option in niche situations where we are working with status effects, for example for a Sen build. The backbar is more straightforward. Infused is usually the only real option. The weapon element doesn't really matter, by the way, unless we need a specific element for support. As enchantments, we can use Crusher or Weakening for support, or any element we need for a status effect. And if we need nothing specific, we can always just use Berserker. We always want the more important enchantment on the backbar and never use the same enchantment twice. Moving on to buff food and attribute points. The 2 most efficient food options are magicka and health, or magicka and magicka regeneration, depending on what stats we need. Magicka regeneration and health food is slightly inefficient. I still consider it good though, as having different buff food options available gives us a lot of flexibility and the stat difference is really minimal. We can put attribute points into health to fine-tune it. We should generally be somewhere between 22 to 25,000. The rest then just goes into magicka. For the Mundus Stone, Ritual is the best for pure healing and Thief for pure damage as well as hybrid rolls. I wouldn't recommend Thief if all the damage you do is blockade and weaving, but even if you just go a little bit more into damage, or you are playing as a damage dealer in trash fights, for example, Thief is, in my opinion, already worthwhile, as the healing loss is generally negligible. In terms of potions, for difficult content, we can use either Essence of Spell Power or Dry Restoration potions, depending on what buffs we get from our group and how much stamina sustain we need. If we wanted to go all out, Harrison potions could be even better, but it's just not worth the cost in most scenarios, in my opinion. Otherwise, the looted Essence of Magicka or Essence of Stamina potions are honestly totally fine in most content. Moving on to the champion points, the green CP mostly doesn't matter, but what I do recommend is Deed's Blessing to better keep up with the group in between fights. For the blue CP on full healing builds, I generally recommend a split of 2 healing and 2 support or survivability nodes. For healing, Soothing Tide and Swift Renewal are usually most impactful. For the other 2 nodes, I normally play Enlivening Overflow and From the Brink. In a trial group, only 1 healer needs them, so you can additionally fit in Hope Infusion. Other open slots can be filled with more healing. When a build has a relevant damage component, I often go just straight for damage nodes as a baseline Backstabber and Wrathful Strikes, Fighting Finesse if I need more critical damage, Force of Nature if I need more penetration, or otherwise a combination of Deadly Aim, Thaumaturge, Master at Arms, and Biting Aura. In the recipe, I almost always use Celerity. In my opinion, movement speed is an amazing defensive tool, especially for healers. Apart from that, siphoning spells can be great for sustain in dungeons. Expert Evasion and Slippery can help with stamina sustain. Spirit Mastery can be useful as well, and Shield Master and Bastion can be nice when actively playing Barrier. And if nothing specific is needed, Boundless Vitality, Fortified, and Rejuvenation are always good. For the last section of this video, we will now go over how Nightblade works in different activities and group compositions. Starting out with dungeons, I think Nightblade is generally amazing. It does really well in supporting small groups and provides great utility in this type of content. I think Warden is ultimately a little bit stronger, especially when it comes to dealing with chaotic and healing intense scenarios, but it also depends a lot on the tank class. Warden tank and Nightblade healer might even be the perfect combination, but there are also good arguments for different combinations. In trials, Warden and Nightblade have absolutely dominated for a while now. There was very little reason to have any other class over Nightblade, as it has very strong support that can only be optimally used by a healer. This will change to a degree with the release of Arcanist, as it also features relatively strong support. However, I do not think it will overtake Nightblade, as Arcanist support can mostly be provided by a tank or damage dealer, and it doesn't really offer unique benefits as a healer. Nightblade particularly shines when you can just spam healing and generate tons of ultimate. That doesn't mean that it's optimal to just do that and leave all the mechanics to other players though, as those also have to deal with micromanaging their own stats and abilities. It's absolutely possible to take over certain mechanics without it affecting the generated ultimate too much, as long as it's nothing that takes up a large amount of global cooldowns. Kiting is in many ways the perfect role for a Nightblade. The only thing you need to keep in mind is that it will affect your ability to apply some of your debuffs, particularly Cowardice and Minor Vulnerability. When one healer in your group switches to DD for trash fights, I think it's usually better for the Nightblade to do the solo healing. Nightblade provides too many good debuffs, and it's relatively difficult to apply those and also deal damage, and as a healer you can just pre-buff your healing and then focus on debuffing without losing out on anything. Asylum Sanctorum is special when it comes to group compositions, as I already mentioned. I think Nightblade is better for front kiter than back kiter, but I don't find the class particularly amazing for this trial in general. Don't get me wrong, it's mobile, survivable, and it can play ZMK really well, but it doesn't really stand out in terms of support like it does in other content. But with that, we are at the end of this guide. If there are things you did not understand and you are looking for more beginner-friendly explanations, I recommend my beginner healing guide. It is linked in the description, together with other useful links for build creation. If you have any further questions, feel free to ask them in the comments, of course. If you like what I am doing and want to support me, I highly appreciate it if you give the video a like or subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching and bye.